We're picking back up on Chapter 13 of Burying the Boys, the CIA, the Mob, and America's Secret History by Daniel Hopsicker. Cuba, the guns, New Orleans, everything. Napoleon called it Isle d'Orleans, the only independent island state in America. From the start, there's always been something a little different about New Orleans, the city that care forgot. The Big Easy anchors a state whose longtime governor, John McKeithen, was the great good friend of father of New Orleans Superdome, New Orleans antiques dealer, and Barry Seal CIA handler, Dave Dixon. Presumably to cover all his bases, McKeithen also had a phone on his desk, which was a hotline wired directly to the Mafia Kingfish himself, Carlos Marcello. After his arrest for murdering Lee Oswald, Jack Ruby had moaned out loud that now everyone was going to find out about what Ruby called Cuba, the guns, New Orleans, everything. Mr. Ruby, we think, had an instinctive notion that everything does not include New Orleans and the state of Louisiana, which comes under some other heading altogether. Louisiana is the kind of place where as soon as you cross the Sabian River coming in from Texas, the road begins to go galump. Galump, galump. And Nancy Poach, a childhood friend of Barry Seal's, and this is on the interstate, for God's sakes, and you wonder, where does the money go? It didn't start with Carlos Marcello or Barry Seal or the 60s Cuban intrigue. There's always a former state official on trial for something or the other, the latest being former Governor Edwin Edwards, for bribery involving everything from casino licenses to insurance. For all that, Edwards is a relatively beloved figure here, having survived 11 grand jury investigations, $2 million worth of influence peddling, a penchant for gambling and women on other than the First Lady, and the most amazingly bad public declaration any public figure has ever made, saying that his only undoing would be if he were caught in bed with a dead girl or a live body, or a live boy. Is the populace outraged? Ask a New Orleans cabbie. I like him, said Clement Johnson. They haven't nailed Edwin yet. Don't think they will. Least he's honest about his dishonesty. According to an eyewitness, Governor Edwards' friendship with Barry Seal was warm enough to have once loaned Seal $10,000 at the gambling tables in Las Vegas. On an occasion when Lady Luck had not been kind to Biggie. Seal later replied the money by casually sending his secretary over to the state capitol bearing that favorite of politicians everywhere, a paper bag full of money. Another eyewitness said Seal's operation passed so much money in bribes to Edwards that it took 3 separate flights and a private plane to get it all safely offshore. It seemed confirmed in a notation we found in Seal's own handwriting. $200,000 to Marion, it read. Marion is the name of Edwards' brother and erstwhile bagman. Because of his experience around the South, DEA agent Dick Gustafson had an interesting vantage point from which to compare the up-and-comer governors of Louisiana and neighboring Arkansas. You can get a bushel basket full of peas in their pods and not find two more alike than Edwin Edwards and Bill Clinton, he stated. Hauling up the ghost of the Kingfish, Huey Long, or his brother Earl, or Sunshine Jimmy Davis, or Edward Grady Parton may help in explaining to Louisiana's particular tolerance for corruption and its affinity for scoundrels. Or maybe it's just something in the air. Barry's smuggling buddy James Poach's father was a local legend, Pappy Poach, Governor Earl Long's personal bodyguard. Pappy would go partying on Bourbon Street with the Gov at the famous door, James recalled, and the girls would come around passing the cap, and Pappy would just take his gun out and set it in the hat, and they'd just go nuts. One time we heard he pulled out a 38 and commandeered a horse carriage in Jackson Square. He threw the tourists out. You could get away with that kind of thing back then. Louisiana was the kind of place where James told us if you had money, you could buy liquor as a kid. It was also small enough so that everyone knew everyone else. Clinton's family repertoire campaign manager, James Carville, grew up just around the corner. James Carville's mother was a World Book salesman in our neighborhood in Gonzales, Poach told us. His sister Nancy Poach was present when young Barry Seal met his first wife after returning from his 6 months Special Forces training. James and Barry came into the house, and we hadn't seen Barry for a long time. He'd lost a lot of weight. Barbara Bottoms was my brother David's girlfriend, and she was over visiting at the house when Barry walked in. That was all it took, I guess. They got married just a couple months later. Barbara's brother, Bill Bottoms, later became one of Barry's chief pilots through the years after he and Barbara had divorced. Since surfacing during the presidential campaign in 1996, he has attempted to debunk what he calls the Mina myth on the internet, where he is well loathed. Back in high school, though, according to Nancy Poach, Billy was just really cute with real blonde hair and blue eyes. In addition to his careers in gun running, narcotics trafficking, and thwarting the investigation into the assassination of the President of the United States, Jack Ruby was a longtime FBI and law enforcement informant. I met Jack Ruby at the heavyweight championship bout between Floyd Patterson and Pete Rademacher in Dallas in the mid-50s. Southern lawman Rex Armistead told us. I was there with a district attorney I've known for 30 years, and we were invited over to a table at the 3525 Club at which were seated Murray and Camel Humphrey Jockey, Willie Shoemaker, Buddy Fogelson, and his wife, the movie star Greer Garson. Their host was Jack Ruby. The next time I saw Ruby, he had his hand in a cast. He told me somebody had accused Patterson of throwing the fight, and incensed Jack had broken his hand punching the guy's face. Thereafter, Armistead continued, every time I went to Dallas, either Jack Ruby or his sister picked me up at the airport in that long blue automobile of his, with his 2 tiny dogs in the back seat. I can remember walking into his nightclub office when he shut the door. On the back of it was a large picture of Jack Kennedy. Ruby was well known for his public relations with Dallas lawmen. Now we heard that this solicitousness extended to lawmen from across the Gulf Coast. When he heard my daddy was in the hospital, he sent a dozen roses to his room. Another law enforcement veteran recalled about Ruby. When we had a vexing murder case with a Dallas connection, Ruby always knew the killer. Titanic Thompson and R.D. Matthews was just a couple I recall old Jack dropping a dime on. One law enforcement source told us he had wanted to visit Ruby in jail after his conviction for killing Lee Oswald, so he phoned an old friend, Captain Will Fritz of the Dallas Police. Fritz dissuaded him from stopping by. He said the jail Ruby was kept in was a CIA facility and entirely under their control. Colorful doesn't begin to describe the wide-open corruption that exists in New Orleans during the 1970s, for example. Rex Armistead told us he had headed an organized crime task force in New Orleans, where he noted that the local New Orleans FBI had a cozy relationship with Carlos Marcello, I drove back behind Carlos's town and country motel on several occasions late that night, where I found FBI agents in government cars conferring with Marcello sitting in the front seat. When I finally had to go down to then FBI Director Clarence Kelly and have him sweep them all out of there, when I was discovered they were tampering with my criminal investigations. Is it any surprise, then, that FBI analysis of Jack Ruby characterizes him as a small-time operator unable to cultivate friendships with important figures in organized crime? The thieves can always be counted on to protect one of their own. Cozy relationships abounded in the steamy New Orleans climate. In the late 1970s, our lawman friend had also learned something else we heard from numerous sources. Barry Seal was known to be working for the DEA. An informant, we asked incredulously. The DEA preferred the term source, smirked this nation. The DEA preferred the term source, smirked this nationally recognized expert on organized crime. I always assumed Seal was CIA, which was why he was let alone. New Orleans was as important in the Cuba intrigue of the early 60s as the more publicized Miami, just below New Orleans. A peeling banana boat named the Santa Ana slipped her moorings at Algiers Naval Base on the Mississippi River a week before the Bay of Pigs invasion and began steaming towards the Gulf of Mexico. With a CIA advisor and exile troops wearing the uniform of Fidel Castro's Cuban army on board, trained at a CIA wilderness camp north of New Orleans on Lake Pontchartrain that will later go black. The men on board were about to attack, not the Cuban communist enemy, but the American base at Guantanamo. The plan was to make Castro look like the aggressor and justify direct American intervention. These men will later attest numerous sources. One of the so-called shooter teams in Dallas at the Kennedy assassination. According to Colonel Fletcher Prouty, intimately involved in the Cuba project, Ike directed that all military-age Cubans be put into the service as a means of controlling them. The CIA began to create the brigade, but in the process there were a lot of Cubans who were not politically acceptable to the others. The CIA took these men and put them in the camp near Lake Pontchartrain. This was the misfit camp, and it had the misfit instructors. When the brigade put to sea for the landing at the Bay of Pigs, continued Prouty, all of the Louisiana Cubans were on a boat that just sailed around in the Gulf. They were never on the landing. Hundreds of these men, irate about the turn of events, later wrote to Kennedy and the CIA saying what they thought. For some reasons, those letters, bales of them, were sent to my office. Not only were the Cubans mad at Kennedy, the instructors were too. This created the nucleus of the gang down there. That gang down there, Prouty maintains, meaning Barry Seal, Guy Bannister, David Ferry, et al., was reporting for plotting and carrying out the Kennedy assassination. Leighton Martins lived with Ferry and worked for Carlos Marcello's lawyer, Ray Gill. He described to us conditions in the Crescent City in the spring of '61. New Orleans received 60,000 Cuban refugees. The town was inundated with people and the infrastructure was sorely taxed. I was just 18 and went to work fundraising from local businesses to provide refugee relief from the Provisional Government of Cuba. Though Leighton doesn't say it, this Provisional Government of Cuba was a largely fictitious entity housed in the 544 camp offices of Guy Bannister. Bannister served as munitions supplier according to former members of his staff. The officers of his detective agency were littered with guns of every distinction, housed in a building located within shouting distance of the local offices of the CIA and FBI. Bannister, who also organized the right-wing paramilitary Minutemen, purveyed a racist periodical and supported the Renegade, off the books anti Castro exile training camp north of New Orleans on the shores of Lake Pontchartrain, was clearly quite the busy fellow. Kennedy's death knell met Kennedy's death knell may have sounded when he reached an agreement to stop the secret war against Cuba with Nikita Khrushchev at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis in late 1962. The Joint Chiefs could not have been pleased after having pressed for an immediate attack on Cuban missiles during the crisis. Knowledge of this fact is still secret history. Discussion of its ramifications so far as we could tell virtually non-existent. Also not pleased were those true original gangsters, the mob, who, to get Castro out of Cuba and the casinos reopened, were willing to entertain alliances with the strangest of bedfellows. General, this is Gudeo. Gudeo, meet the general. Shakespeare said it best when he told us why treason never prospers, because, of course, then none dare call it treason. Clues to what happened come from all over. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, for example, was sent to meet with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobryan. In his memoirs, Premier Nikita Khrushchev quotes Bobby Kennedy as saying, "The president is in a grave situation. We are under pressure from our military to use force against Cuba. If the situation continues much longer, the president is not sure that the military will overthrow him and seize power." Leighton Martins told us the CIA discovered the missiles in late May of 61. At that point, the second invasion became moot. I was there seeing U.S. government estimates of what would have happened if Kennedy had moved on Cuba. You can expect 150,000 troop losses, it said, and the southeast United States would be irradiated. The Soviets would have engaged us in a shooting war, continues Martins. Subsequent to that realization, everything else, especially including the phony plans for a second invasion, became nothing but political chit. A bitter internal struggle was underway. Angered over the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the CIA refused to bend to Kennedy's will and continued their destabilization campaign against Castro, of sabotage raids and plots against Castro's life undertaken by mob figures Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana, and Santos Traficante. In the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which had brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, Kennedy sent FBI and other agents to Florida and Louisiana to clamp down on the cowboys in the training camps. His orders to disband CIA paramilitary bases in Florida and Louisiana went unheeded. Soon, renegade exile commandos were attacking Cuban ports without approval from Washington. On March 26, 1963, an offshoot of Alpha 66 severely damaged a Soviet ship, prompting Moscow to protest vehemently. President Kennedy moved firmly to disassociate himself and the United States from the raids. Strict federal action against exile extremists dated from this episode. Antonia Venciana and other activists were severely restricted. 13 years later, he made a startling revelation under questioning by the Senate Intelligence Committee, identifying an out-of-control element of the CIA as being behind the unauthorized provocation. Veciana testified his group attacked Soviet ships in Cuban ports on orders from Maurice Bishop, the code name for his American intelligence handler, David Atlee Phillips, chief of the Mexico City CIA station and veteran of the glorious victory over landless peasants in Guatemala. Said Veciana, "It was my case officer, Maurice Bishop, who had the idea to attack the Soviet ships. The intention was to cause trouble between Kennedy and Russia. Bishop believed that Kennedy and Khrushchev had made a secret agreement that the USA would do nothing more to help the fight against Castro, and felt he told me many times that President Kennedy was a man without experience surrounded by a group of young men who were also inexperienced with mistaken ideas on how to manage this country. He said you had to put Kennedy against the wall in order to force him to make decisions that would remove Castro's regime. Here's the real secret's history. A shadowy, extra-constitutional presence deliberately sabotaged Kennedy's search for an understanding with the Soviet Union, just as they had deliberately sabotaged the search for peace of Eisenhower before him. This is not conspiracy theory. It is instead conspiracy fact. There was a secret war going on in 1963, but not between the Kennedy administration and Fidel Castro. The real secret war was a no-holds-barred fight to the death between the President of the United States of America and his Central Intelligence Agency. Though Kennedy clearly distrusted the CIA, he still made longtime CIA operative General Edward Lansdale, the Ugly American, of the famous novel of the same name, head of the CIA's assassination program against Castro, Operation Mongoose. Kennedy had made too many powerful enemies, and now he had committed a fatal mistake, giving his foes the keys to a souped-up assassination machine, which had, in short order, turned on its creator. The battlefield had now been, in the CIA's phrase, prepared. New Orleans sits alongside the Mississippi, and also on the south shore of a large freshwater lake, Lake Pontchartrain. On the lake's north shore lay Carlos Marcello's hunting lodge in Lacombe, where researchers suspect one of the shooter teams bivouacked. Bivouacked. Never heard that word before. Bivouacked. According to an FBI informant, Marcello associate Sam Benton had almost 2,500 pounds of dynamite hidden there and was negotiating to obtain a B-24 aircraft to bomb Castro's oil refineries in a joint operation between two extremist anti-Castro groups, the Christian Democratic Movement and the DRE. The raid was set for August 63, with two aircraft to take off from an airship near the Lacombe camp on a fight to bomb Havana's oil refineries. Prodded by Bobby Kennedy, the FBI raided the house in Lacombe storing the dynamite and the training camp nearby. Royal Dutch Shell Oil Corporation retained a fondness for their seized refineries in Havana. It seemed a reluctance to return in the future to find bomb craters where the refinery had been, and a willingness to make their feelings known at the highest levels of official Washington. Fervent anti-communism is all well and good, but business is business. Press reports in the New Orleans papers revealed that in early morning hours of July 31st, FBI agents swooped down, seizing a cache of arms, 48 cases of dynamite, 20 100-pound bomb casings, napalm, blasting cap, primer cord, and over a ton of explosives. but they declined to reveal to reporters if any arrests had been made, or even to name the owner of the property raided. As it turned out, it belonged to Mike McClaney's brother, William Julius McClaney of New Orleans. McClaney's wife told reporters that the cottage had been loaned to a Cuban exile friend. She said she and her husband had operated a tourist business in Havana, but left because Castro made things impossible down there. The Lacombe raid assumed a prominent role in Jim Garrison's investigation of the Kennedy assassination. He believed that exiles training there for an assassination attempt on Castro had been spun off into the successful attempt on Kennedy. He accuses the McClaney brothers running the camp of serving with the CIA with a renegade off-the-books training site and arms cache. And he asserted there had been two anti-Castro groups training north of Lake Pontchartrain. One overt, the other covert. The covert group, he said, was led by this ubiquitous David Ferry, who drilled 5-man commando teams in guerrilla warfare practice and infiltration techniques on a site adjacent to the McClaney cottage. According to the New Orleans State item, immediately after the Lacombe raid, the so-called overt Cuban group disappeared. The thread that winds through the story involves one of the central problems of John F. Kennedy's 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days in the White House. The problem of Cuba, stated Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Haynes Johnson in contemporaneous coverage of Garrison's investigation, it is Garrison's obvious contention that Cubans were somehow involved in the president's death. His case appears to rest, writes Johnson, on one theory about the assassination, that Oswald was working with an anti-Castro right-wing organization and actually intended to kill Fidel. That Oswald's publicly pro-communist activities in New Orleans and his attempts to enter Mexico and secure a Cuban visa were a ruse. This was heady stuff in the 60s, before Americans had learned to become suspicious of people who kept diaries, traveled constantly, and looked slightly dazed after committing their senseless act. Garrison charged that David Ferry, Jack Ruby, and Lee Oswald were all involved in training paramilitary groups of Cuban exiles and American neo-Nazis north of Lake Pontchartrain near the McClaney home. After Kennedy ordered a crackdown on these CIA-supported activities, he believed the Cubans had turned their sights on him. The raid on McClaney cottage in Lacombe signed Kennedy's death warrant. His investigators easily discovered that Bill McClaney's brother, Mike McClaney, had operated a gambling casino in Havana for Meyer Lansky. 3 months before the FBI raid on McClaney, Havana casino had been nationalized by Castro at a loss of many millions to its owners. Mike McClaney sent the CIA a detailed plan for knocking out 3 Havana refineries. But instead of getting his plan approved, he got an urgent phone call warning him not to attempt such a thing under any circumstances. Years later, McClaney organized a multi-million-dollar effort to take over casinos in the Bahamas for Las Vegas mobsters. When his bribery of public officials in Nassau was exposed, the Bahamian government fell, amid accusations that McClaney had tried to engineer the assassination for the Prime Minister. It had to be admitted that these acts are consistent with someone who could credibly have been associated with the Kennedy assassination. The exiles arrested at Lacombe worked with a group of CIA contract agents led by Gary Hemming, known as the No Name Key Group, for their training base in the Florida Keys. A decade later, when witnesses and evidence began to point to CIA anti-Castro movement in the assassination in the 70s, former CIA agent Victor Marchetti claimed the CIA was considering a limited hangout in which it would admit that some of its members were involved in the assassination. These are those guys. Howard Hunt wrote, Nino Diaz had been dusted off and, together with 100 untrained followers, sent to the CIA amphibious base on Lake Pontchartrain, Louisiana. But back in 1967, the hapless FBI could find no traces of this base. During the years 1960, 1961, and 1962, no information was obtained from sources regarding a camp where guerrilla training was given to Cuban exiles in Lake Pontchartrain area. In 1967, a mere existence of the Pontchartrain base was still secret history. It was the camp that wasn't there until Hayes wrote Johnson wrote of Garrison's notations. Oh dear. I gotta start over. It was the camp that wasn't there until Hayes Johnson wrote of Garrison's notions about the existence of a training camp for Cubans in St. Tammany Parish across Lake Pontchartrain in the summer of 1963, where supposedly Oswald went for the purpose of participating in the plot to kill Castro. The CIA denied in 1967 even having knowledge of the camp at Lacombe. Old hands at station confirmed JMWAVE Miami was the only agency-sponsored training camp. To the best of station knowledge, there was no station or agency supporting or funding of the Christian Democratic Movement, CDM, training camp. By the time the truth finally did start to dribble out, the coup plotters had such a firm grip on the media that it made barely a ripple. New Orleans resident George Wilcox told historian Michael Kurtz he had observed Ferry, Oswald, and numerous Cubans all dressed in military fatigues and carrying automatic rifles conducting what appeared to be a military training maneuver near Bedicio Creek, a swampy inland body of water, a bayou near Lacombe, on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain. In early September 1963, 2 months after the government raid on anti-Castro guerrilla camps in the United States. Then something major happened. In 1979, investigators of the House Select Committee on Assassinations discovered a training film from the archives of Georgetown University. Ferry, Oswald Bannister, and David Atlee Phillips were on an 8mm home movie shot in the summer of 1963. Grab yourself some popcorn. We're going to see a movie. It's a shadowy landscape, almost a moonscape, at dusk, and the film is grainy. An old 8mm film taken during September of 1963. Trees and bushes are dark looming shapes in some semi-tropical clime with palmettos and Spanish moss and hanging vines. Coming down an open road, we see a line of 2-ton military trucks. When they stop, a group of soldiers leap out and fan across the road, wearing fatigues and carrying rifles, machine guns, and mortar components. The scene changes. We see flashes from rifle muzzles as soldiers practice laying down fire. While their comrades rush across the field, a mortar team lobs rounds off into the distance, covering their ears with their hands. An open Jeep roars past. Its headlights pick up a road sign with the shape of the state of Louisiana and a number. Cut to 5 men in huddled conversation in the dusk around the Jeep. They include Antonio Viciana, of CIA-backed Alpha 66, and Guy Bannister, whose 544 Camp Street office address is stamped on Lee Harvey Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba Committee Literature. Even though Bannister is CIA and Oswald is supposed to be a commie sympathizer, then we see a tall figure wearing civilian clothes, dark hair, a prominent nose, and deeply impressed wrinkles under his eyes, turning away from the camera to avoid being photographed. It's the infamous Maurice Bishop, CIA officer David Atlee Phillips from the Mexico City station, who Venciano will later finger to congressional investigators as being with Oswald in Dallas just a month before the Kennedy assassination. The camera goes slow-mo to move to another group loitering at a nearby truck. One of the men in this group turns to the camera and starts to smile or smirk. Really, the famous smirk of Lee Harvey Oswald, caught on 8mm film training with the CIA's renegade anti-Castro Cubans. Cut to a daylight scene, men shooting guns posing with weapons, and there are several more long shots of Oswald wearing a black t-shirt and a ball cap, and close-ups of a round-faced man with a fright wig and impossibly thick phony eyebrows. "It's Dave Ferry," he breathed. House investigator Robert Tenenbaum, today the mayor of Beverly Hills, California, when he first saw the film. Nobody else looks like Ferry. Someone took a film of the infamous paramilitary camp in Lacombe, the camp which housed the killers of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The men at the Lacombe training camp were the top terrorists in the Cuban community. American adventurer and CIA agent Gary Patrick Hemming admitted 20 years later. "The movie was shocking to me because it demonstrated the notion that the CIA was training in America, a separate army," Tenenbaum said later. "It was shocking because I'm a true believer in the system, and yet there are notorious characters in the system who are being funded by the system, who are absolutely un-American, and who knows what they would do eventually. What if we send people to Washington who they can't deal with? Out comes their secret army?" Then something else happened. You can guess. No, the film didn't get lost. It was stolen. After this discovery of a film as important as the Zapruder film, this 8mm home movie taken in the summer of 1963 vanished. While in the custody of the House Select Committee on Assassinations of the House of Representatives of the United States of America, it was stolen and never recovered. Who has the power to pull a black bag job in our nation's capital? On one of the three co-equal branches of the United States government. Probably not the Ghostbusters. Yeah, January 6th. That's it for today.